Okay, I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how to build up asynchronous muscles, but we're going to have a little journey in getting there. How many of you, and stand up if you are a manager of people? You manage other people. Okay, you can sit down. If you don't manage other people, stand up. I just want you to not fall asleep. We're going to do this several times. Okay. I'm going to go through a lot of actually tactical advice, but one of the things that I've found as I've done this with organizations is every time we do manager training, about half the managers fall asleep in manager training and aren't really paying attention. And about 10 to 20% of them take the content back to their team and do something. But if you actually give the same training, the same content, the same tactical tips to entire organizations and teams, someone on their team picks up on it. And someone sits there and goes, we're going to give this a try. And what I'm going to share with you today are things that I've gleaned from my work. Not only, I've managed distributed teams, which we didn't call it at the time, but basically teams who are spread out across multiple cities for 20 years. I've done it as a startup guy, I've done it at Google, I've done it at Slack. I'm going to pull some of those learnings together along with learnings from other organizations I'm working with, like Airbnb, Allstate, and Atlassian, just to pick on people whose company name begins with A. Because they are actually trying different things and experimenting with different ways of working that actually all the rest of us can learn from. And one of my favorite parts is sort of sharing what I'm hearing and seeing from other people. When we talk about flexibility in the workplace, the conversation, everything from the headlines through Andy Jassy, through everything else, is about place. It's about remote work versus hybrid work versus in-office, what's best, what's worst. The real truth of the matter is where you work matters less than when you work. The times that we are compressing into our calendars, the number of meetings and the other stuff that we're doing is actually a bigger impediment both to our personal lives and well-being as well as focus time to get work done. This is data from Future Forum that we ran the same survey every quarter for about 3 years, asking people their preferences around workplace flexibility and schedule flexibility. Schedule flexibility actually came out to be more important for more people every single quarter that we measured it. And you can kind of understand why. If I let you work from home, but I jam your day full of meetings from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m., it doesn't matter if you're sitting in the office or sitting at home. You have no time to either get focused work done or to deal with the kids or to go to the gym or to actually find a way to just even get a break within the course of your day. We've done this a lot as we've moved into hybrid ways of working because what we've done is we've substituted the 30-minute meeting for the 5-minute phone call. We've substituted the 30-minute meeting for the status check that could have been an email or a Slack message. And it's turning everybody's calendars into Swiss cheese. And what happens if you compress that time that's available to meetings and squeeze it down is you get higher productivity because people have time to focus on the things that matter the most. And so I'm going to go a bit into what that looks like. The challenge with this is a lot of executives spend their time in meetings all day because everything they do is collaboration. So they think the collaboration looks like the thing on the left-hand side of the chart, right? People actively communicating and going back and forth. Anybody familiar with Cal Newport? So Cal Newport, known for the hyperactive hive mind, known for blaming email and Slack for destroying knowledge work, but other than that, nothing problematic. But his argument essentially is that technologies themselves have enabled people to be connected to their work on a nonstop basis and to message each other on a nonstop basis. And he's right. But there's no chance in Hades we're rolling back and saying, I'm sorry, we're getting rid of email and we're getting rid of Slack and we're getting rid of Teams and we're going back to paper, right? The challenge is in how do we manage ourselves and how do we manage our teams? And how do we do the thing that's on the right-hand side? There's like decades of academic evidence that shows that giving people dedicated chunks of focus time to do deep work and interleaving that with synchronous time with your teams on a regular basis produces the best results, not only at the individual level, but at the team level as well. So I'm going to talk through some of the challenges and how do you get there? How do you build up that set of muscles so that you have those blocks in your calendar so that you have time to get deep work done, which involves actually moving some of the stuff that we've jammed into meetings into asynchronous ways of working. But I'm going to get there with a couple of other steps in between. The first one, oddly enough, is goal setting. How many of you, stand up if you think you could tell me what the top 3 goals are for your team this year and how you're going to measure success? Top 3. Justin better stand up. Justin better stand up. Can anybody even like how many of you feel like you have no idea how your team even measures success? True confession time. Some of you must. One of the challenges with all this that I've seen in most organizations is we substitute things like activity and meetings for actually figuring out what's most important in our organization. And I'm going to get into meetings in a minute, but this is Microsoft study from 2 years ago, where they were getting at what is the biggest impediment to driving down people's personal productivity. And outside of meetings, lacking clear goals is a big part of it. Atlassian took this a step further. 87% of executives say their teams don't have visibility into each other's goals. And so you spend all this time aligning around what is it we're actually trying to accomplish as opposed to doing the work. If you can start here, if you can start with alignment around what are our goals as a team, what's our shared purpose and vision, it's going to make the rest of it a lot easier. And Sasha and I have both done this in a bunch of different settings, and this is why. Too often we start these conversations around things like team norms. Everybody today loves a team norm in a hybrid organization around moments that matter. What are the times that we come together, and why do we come together in an office? They love the conversation we're going to get into around meetings, but the problem is all of those conversations are much less important than the ones that come first, which is understanding what's the purpose of this team in the first place that I'm working on. Because if I get that, it's a lot easier to think about how we take some of this content and do it asynchronously. Do I understand what my role is in doing this? Do I understand how we're going to measure performance and know whether or not we're on the right track? If you can do that, you're going to be able to make the rest of this happen a lot faster. And maybe the most important place to do that is how many of you actually work as members of cross-functional teams, primarily on projects? More than half the room. Every time you get thrown into a new project, is it really clear that you know what the goals are for what you're trying to accomplish? Right? This is the more important starting point. So even though we're going to talk about asynchronous ways of working and killing off meetings, you've got to start off with goal alignment within a team. Now, if you want focus time, you got to find a way to tame the meetings monster. These are the first and the third. This is my favorite part of this Microsoft slide. What drives down your productivity? Number 1, meetings. Number 2, lack of goals. Number 3, meetings. I think there's a theme going on here. We actually polled executives, about 1,500 of them, about a year and a half ago, and we get the same answers out of executives that we do out of employees. You get about 50% of people saying that you get people saying that about half their meetings inside their company are ineffective, literally a waste of time. One of my favorites was our CTO at Slack who said, yeah, but I know where the problem is and it's not me, right? He was joking, but he was saying, look, all of us look at our own meetings and think, ours are better than the other person's, or it's probably good enough, as opposed to understanding, that we all have to take a role in cutting back on things that are wasteful. One of the biggest challenges I've heard from executives is the reason why people are crowding into more meetings, especially in a hybrid and virtual way of working, is because of FOMO, because they feel like they're going to be left out of a conversation. We'll come back to that later. We've also got evidence it's not true. If you ask individuals, why did you attend a meeting that you thought was a waste of time? The number one reason is you made me be there in the first place. You mandated my attendance in something that was not a good use of time. So how do we address that? I'm going to give you a few tactical tips, and I'd also like to stop at a few points in this and ask people what else you've seen work inside your own organization. At Slack, we actually wrote an internal meetings guideline document that started off with a really simple phrase: does this need to be a meeting? And if people can't stipulate up front what the purpose of the meeting is, what the agenda is about, then it doesn't need to be a meeting in the first place. The 3 Ds are meetings are for debates, for decision making, and maybe the most important one, development. For development of people as individuals and development of teams. One of the things I've seen happen over the course of the past couple of years is leaders of teams fall into, my meetings need to be efficient. I'm an efficiency guru, I'm gonna make my meetings as efficient as possible. That's great if it's a debate or a decision-making forum. It's not so hot when it comes to team development. If all you're doing with your weekly team meeting is jumping straight into the work, you're missing an opportunity to have connection happen on a regular basis that's social in nature. A couple leaders said to me, what I really miss is I miss the conversation we have before the meeting in the past when everybody was in the office about how was your weekend or how are the kids. So my answer back was, why don't you actually do that in your virtual meetings? Why don't you start off? Well, that would be unproductive. What's more important? Do you immediately get productive or that you actually feel connected to one another and building up that set of momentum? So giving people permission to say no is a big deal. It's going to be hard for people at the individual level to do that unless leaders themselves model it and start asking the question, especially when your team is being invited to someone else's meeting, do we actually understand the purpose of this? Do we actually need to be there, or could this be a status update that we send around in Slack or an email? Calendar discipline at the team level. Atlassian actually produced one of my favorite studies on this. Atlassian did two things simultaneously, and they actually ran a multi-part experiment around this. They had teams think a lot more deeply about how they thought about the use of their calendar in a couple of really specific ways. One was looking at the calendar at the beginning of the week, every week, as a team, and saying, do the meetings we have on the calendar make sense? Are these meetings valuable? Are they going to make progress on the goals that we've got as a team and an organization? The second is you can see some blocks in here that are really interesting called open collaboration. These are literally times when they say we're going to be available to each other, no set agenda beforehand. That gives you a place where you can actually have conversations about things that have come up over the course of the day or just make social connection out of it. But it's a way to say, how am I going to coordinate, especially with people that, when Sasha was asking earlier, most of you are working with teams that spread across time zones, right? Figuring out how to coordinate your calendar so that you've got the deep focus time that you need, which is the yellow blocks, together with the meetings that you need, together with times for you to be in sync with your team and just having conversations is a really important thing to do. The other factor that they did is they not only built a practice around weekly reviews of the calendar of the team and what they were doing, they actually paired it with goal setting. So the exercise is the following. I asked up front, how many of you know what the top 3 goals are for your team and how you'll measure success? How many of you once a week sit there and say, I know what my top 3 goals are for this week? It's a hard practice to get into, but it's literally what they did. Everyone on the team is expected at the beginning of the week to be able to write out what are the 3 most important things for me to accomplish this week. Over the course of the week, at the end of the day, they did a virtual check-in. How are you doing against those 3 goals? That simple reminder on a daily basis allowed them to sit there and say, what am I there for? If I'm behind on this, that becomes my focus time block tomorrow. That combination of calendar discipline within a team, a manager who's protecting the focus time for their team, and getting into a real rhythm around how you're actually thinking about the goals that you're setting, had huge impact. The yellow bars are their percentage improvement on what percentage of their people agreed that they were making progress on their top priorities, that they were better communicating as a team after the calendar experiment, et cetera, more goal activity, less exhaustion, better decision making. The blue ones are when you add in tracking against goals as well, right? So the combination of the two is the most powerful thing that you can do as a team. Atlassian, by the way, publishes all this stuff online, and if anybody wants it, I'll gladly share my slides afterwards. The second big issue that Sasha got at earlier is teams that are spread out across multiple time zones. And I've talked with a lot of virtual first organizations, as well as big people who are in office who are struggling with. We now have teams that are spread across 3 time zones and sometimes span across oceans. And we don't have a way in which we are figuring out what hours are we committing to be available to each other. And so core collaboration hours is one of my favorite concepts. We did this with my team at Future Forum, 10 a.m. until 2 p.m. West Coast time, which translates to 1 until 5 on the East Coast, were the hours Monday through Thursday that we said we would be committed and available to each other for meetings, for one-on-ones, for quick chats, for phone calls, for whatever was needed. That means you schedule the doctor's appointments outside of those hours. That means you schedule the kid pickup outside of those hours. But you're making that commitment with intention so that you know how you're actually coordinating. It's a simple thing to do within a team. It's hard to defend against other teams that then try to come in there and grab it. But if you start building the muscle within one team and you're seeing it's working, you can take it to others. The graphic here is Dropbox, and it's what Dropbox did on a global basis. Dropbox did a huge shift to virtual first, almost at the beginning of the pandemic. They shed 80% of their office space. That was honestly, and they opened up the aperture in terms of where they were hiring from. That was the easier decision. What they had a harder time with was, how do we actually find ways in which we have overlapping hours, not only across, for example, San Francisco and New York, but how do we do that with our team in Dublin? And how does that happen in Asia Pacific and in other parts of the world? This doesn't work perfectly in all situations. If you're in a sales team, it's a heck of a lot harder to do. But if you can start constraining it down to internal communications, then you can get a lot better at it. Those constraints also force discipline in meetings, and they force discipline around getting better at asynchronous communication. Dropbox happens to also sell tools that are oriented around better, collaboration. And so it's in their interest to figure out how you do that. And last one on this one, sorry, before I leave that, is this a struggle that people have? Figuring out how you and your team align around time? Has anyone gotten a better solution? Or another way that you've tackled this?
One is I find this kind of time zone. So I've been doing 12-hour time zone spreads. So it's a game you got to get good at. It forces you to learn, as you just touched on, I want to emphasize, it forces you to learn the asynchronous versus synchronous part.
Yeah, it does.
Then why do we need to meet becomes a conversation. Make all calendars visible, even if you hide who you're meeting, making the times that are free and blocked lets you set up your lunches and things like that. It also then lets people see, because the last thing I ever want to be involved in is a conversation where someone says, hey, can I meet you for 30 minutes? Yes. What about Tuesday at 2 o'clock? No, what about Wednesday at 3 o'clock? I don't care. Find a time on my calendar. I don't have time for this. My calendar is visible and accurate. And I think that's a good leveraging tool here.
I think that's great.
That's it.
Yeah, visibility into people's calendars so you can see it, and defaulting to public visibility if you can is great. The other thing that it'll give you is we have unfortunately too often devolved into, I need 5 minutes with you. Great, I'll go look at your calendar. Our next mutual half-hour block is next week for a 5-minute conversation that would clear something today. Get in the habit, especially within your team, of just DMing somebody and saying, are you available for a quick chat now? And at Slack, we literally built the Huddles feature just expressly for that, right? The entire reason Huddles exists is because we're kind of sick of scheduling yet another Zoom meeting on the calendar. Make it much easier for somebody to sit there and say, can we just talk for 5 minutes because it looks like you're available? And solve the problem right then and there. Sasha talked a little bit about meetings guidelines. I may have put this slide in as she was talking to make sure we had something on paper. This is how the two of us work together sometimes. This is something that I'm actually working on with one of my clients right now, and their phrase for it is setting the table, right? How do you set up so that a meeting is going to be successful in the first place? What are the rules, the road for doing it? An agenda, like the obvious stuff. Do we have an agenda for this thing? And do we have a goal? Like, what are we trying to accomplish by getting together? Second is, I've seen people stumble in this. How many of you like being in a meeting where it's an hour long and the presentation takes 45 minutes and then you get into the important stuff at the end? Is that fun? No, no one likes that. We have horrible discipline is what it comes down to as human beings, right? People say, great, sometimes we're sending out the pre-reads. If sometimes you send out the pre-reads, I guarantee you nobody does the pre-reads. If the boss never does the pre-reads, I guarantee you it doesn't matter because you're going to end up with that 45-minute presentation. So there's only two ways I've ever seen this work. The boss actually pre-reads stuff. The manager of the team, whatever, because they're setting the tone for everybody else. Or you don't, and you do something else instead, which is off of like Amazon's been doing this for years. We did it at Slack. Open the document. You have 5 minutes. Turn your camera off. When you're done reading, turn your camera back on. The moderator's got to call everybody together at some point. Now we can start talking because you've actually done the pre-read in the meeting. It actually is effective and it can work. There's no such thing as a debate or a decision that gets made in a 20, 30, 75, 150 person meeting. There's just not. It doesn't happen. Those may be communication. Anything that's bigger than 10 people, unless it's development of a team that happens to be a little bit bigger, can be done asynchronously, right? You can share the content in the video out. You can run the all hands and let everybody watch the all hands, but you also are going to be recording it and shipping it around so people around the globe can see it. There's evidence around this too. 8 people or less actually makes for a much more effective meeting, especially when you're trying to make a decision around something. Make sure everybody who joins can contribute. Sasha's sitting in this little corner over here with this room in the center. One of the things that I found doesn't work is the person who's leading the meeting also trying to be the person who's monitoring what's going on with the remote participants doesn't work. Separate the 2 roles out. Do 2 things. Have a hybrid meeting moderator. Their job is to sit in the room, laptop open, participating in the chat, watching what's going on inside the room, and making sure that the people on video can actually break in. At Google, 7 years ago, my team actually created 2 rules. Have a hybrid meeting moderator, except we called it have a virtual meeting moderator, and video wins. They put it on little placards in the conference rooms. Other teams would walk over and they're like, well, that's really good. They started making their own copies of it. We started finding this thing in other buildings. We started finding this thing in other cities. Simple rules like that can actually make your life a lot easier, and giving those rules to your team might help. Decide who's the note taker, end with a clear decision, and send the meeting notes out. AI tools can help you a lot more with this now. My own experience is sometimes it's hit or miss about their quality, but the more the person who is in charge of the meeting can take also responsibility for making sure that what got talked about gets communicated out, the easier it is to have that smaller audience that's having the conversation and not have 30 other people going, why was I excluded? And why was I left out? So if you're able to start taming meetings and pulling them down, you can start building up more asynchronous muscles as well. This doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen by saying to an entire organization, let's get asynchronous. Like, I hate the word in the first place. Let's get document driven, is one of the things that the Atlassian team talks about. But you've got to find places where people are starting to pilot and test new ways of doing it and take it out more broadly. One of the best places to start this on almost any given team, when we polled people about what's a wasteful meeting in the Future Forum content, besides the mandatory meeting, the thing that came up the most often was the status update. We had this at Slack when I joined. Monday morning, how many of you have a Monday morning meeting equivalent that's like the Monday morning project thing? When I started at Slack, it was 65 people. We were only a 300-person company. It grew, and it was about an hour long, and it grew to 80, and then 100, and then 150. And it went from an hour to an hour and a half to 2 hours. And it was literally people waiting their turn to say on track. And God, you wanted to say on track fast and get off of it and get on to the next thing, right? They'd pull up the Jira, and we'd be going through it one step at a time, and you'd be sitting there twiddling your thumbs for it. So several of us said, this is stupid and a waste of time. Why are we spending? You add up the hours and figure it out. What we had to do, though, was get really clear about what process we wanted to have happen. Jira is the tool of record. Fridays at noon, every major piece of work, every project has to have a status update that's up to date. It gets rolled up at the product area level. Product area leaders, the engineering and product manager, are responsible for the quality of it. Monday morning, the chief of staff would look at all of it that was condensed in one place. They'd have a standing meeting of 12 people who were resource owners, and they would invite 6 to 8 other people to attend. And in 45 minutes, we would do what we needed to do, which is talk about the things that were off track and talk about resource contentions. Because we're able to actually figure out how to get the stuff that people were wasting time on out of the meeting and into an asynchronous way of working. Once you start building it within one team, you can take it to another by translating it. And I'll get into another example of that in a bit. But that translation of how we did that from a product and engineering perspective didn't work for the sales team. But you could find similar ways to think about things like, how am I going to do my pipeline reviews on an asynchronous basis at least every once in a while? And the last thing on this in terms of doing it is you've got to actually want to put time and effort against this. When I've worked with organizations and we've talked about, the executives are the ones that are most worried about time together. The executives, they're the ones that want to develop norms around when is it important for me to get people together in person. When we poll teams and look at the sort of especially manager level in an organization, everybody says that's not my problem. My problem is I have a problem with focus time and getting stuff done, and I have too many meetings on my calendar. And if you're serious about it, you can actually put resources behind it. So one of the things we did at another client that I was working with is we actually developed a quarterly pulse survey that was already rolling, that was doing things like how, what's our employee net promoter score, what's people's intent to stay. We started weaving in a couple of simple questions. Do you have focus time do you have 2-hour or larger blocks at least 3 times a week during the work week? Number 2, do you feel like the meetings in your function are effective? Just those 2 questions. We then would look at that and how those questions related back to things like people's intent to stay and their level of burnout. And we measured it on a function by function basis. And then we started experimenting with one team and saw that it was getting better. And then we took it to another. And then we started talking as an executive group about who's actually doing really well. And it became not quite the contest we wanted, but that actually caused people to pay attention to it and executives in particular to support it. Doing that, in my experience, usually takes some way in which if you want to start making these habits real, you've got to find some way of breaking the habit of we just basically stumble through our weeks, right? We wake up on Monday morning, the calendar says be in the following meetings, and we tend to go forward with it. We did 2 things at Slack that were experiments at first that we then expanded out. How many of you are in organizations that have done no meeting weeks? Maker weeks? No meeting. No meeting. Not quite at the week level. Day level. We'll get to that. No meeting weeks can be really effective. I did this with a team at Google years ago, and it became a quarterly habit. And then I've also seen it at other teams there, and then we took it to Slack. A quarterly no meeting week just basically says we're going to cancel all recurring meetings on 1 week. Anything that is a standing recurring meeting, a project meeting, a status meeting, the meetings with your boss, all the rest of it, kill it for 1 week. But we want you to do 2 things. If you're a meeting owner, we want you to look at that meeting and figure out and spend half the time you would have spent in the meeting figuring out, does it actually follow the rules that we've put out? Is there an agenda? Is there a purpose behind it? Are the right people in the meeting? Is this an 8-person meeting that's grown to be 32 people? Why is it now back to 32 people? What are we going to do about it? Does this need to be weekly? Could we do it bi-weekly? Could we do it once a month? Could we do it asynchronously? And you start building up muscles around it. For everybody else, it's a break, right? It's like, okay, I get a respite. I get a chance to do things. With the engineering and product teams, these often get called maker weeks. When we took it to the sales team in Slack, it got called customer week. Because the focus was I can take that time that I would have spent internally sitting in meetings, and I can put it back in with my customers, which may have been helpful in selling it to our chief revenue officer. No meeting days, back to the other point. I've, for 20 years, attempted to find ways to make this work, and some have been more and less successful. How many of you have ever been in a place that declared calendar bankruptcy? Meaning flush all the meetings off of calendars entirely? Am I really alone? You've done it? Okay. Calendar bankruptcy is you take an organization and you just basically say, wipe everything and start fresh. It results in utter chaos. Okay? Especially the bigger the organization, the harder it is to do. But that fresh restart can kind of work. The problem is most people come back to old habits, and by the time you're 2 months out, things look just as bad as they did. No meeting days are a great idea that usually disappears within 6 months. I joined Slack in 2017. I was probably a month in, and I kept on doing this thing where I'm like, I can't get my team together. Oh, Wednesday's open. Great, I'll grab an hour. I can't get to Bob, but Wednesday's open. I'll grab, and somebody a month in goes, Brian, we don't have meetings on Wednesdays. I'm like, really? Because I keep getting invited to meetings, and I'm in meetings. Like, yeah, we talked about that 6 months ago, and then we didn't talk about it again, and it's kind of fallen apart. So without reinforcement, these things don't work. The other thing that doesn't work is without rules of the road. So we debated this hard when we brought it back at Slack. Focus Fridays is where we landed. Focus Fridays means no internal meetings. That was important because the sales team was like, you got to be kidding me. This just doesn't work. I can't tell my clients, I'm sorry, no, I don't take meetings on Fridays. And by the way, I may need to occasionally pull in somebody else from marketing or from product. And I'm getting some heavy nods in the back of the room. The other thing that we said you can't say no to is if recruiting says this candidate is available to be interviewed on a Friday, you're going to interview the candidate on a Friday. It's just the way it works, right? So external things can be important. Second thing was, one of our executives said, my calendar's jammed. There's no way, I don't have time to give up. Would you like me to disappoint the people that want the one-downs or the projects or anything else? So we actually came up with a design rule that said, who we're really looking to protect are the most burned out humans in our organization, which is our managers and our directors. So no meetings with people director level and below on Fridays. If you want to have meetings with VPs, if you want to have meetings with customers, knock your socks off. But these are the people whose time we're trying to protect. And then what we did is we started measuring it. We put it out there, we talked about it, we reinforced it, and we started actually measuring whether or not people were taking it up. That one thing had 85% of our employees saying that they felt that that was anywhere from a moderate to significant employment benefit. I had the head of our Australia group, by the way, Australia did it on Mondays. This is one of the other negotiating things like with Dropbox. Australians taking off Friday is really hard because if they're corresponding with folks in the US where it's Thursday, they have a really hard time. So it was Mondays in Australia, it was Sundays in Israel, and you figure out how to piece it together. The Australian head, though, basically offered up and said, I will trade you the following. Let's just see if it works or not. I will put meetings back on your calendars on Friday, but I'll give you an extra day off a month. And every single person in her organization said no, voted no. It was more important to them to have the focus time within a working week than it was to have a day off, because it's rest, recuperation, and an opportunity to not feel that level of 5-day burnout that comes up. The other thing that's really hard from an asynchronous perspective that you have to make decisions about as a team is what tools to use and for what purpose. How many of you are Slack shops? Working in Slack shops? How many teams? How many of you have both? Yeah, okay, your life is from hell. I'm so sorry. There are organizations I work with that have Slack and Teams and chat and WhatsApp. All four, right? And you're never sure where the message is going to come from, let alone email versus all of those, right? Rules of the road around what you're using are really important just from a straightforward communication standpoint. Understanding what you use these tools for makes it for a lot more clarity about it. Second thing is obviously what's our system of record for projects. I'm working with a company right now where engineering uses Jira, marketing uses Trello, the finance organization uses Excel spreadsheets, and I don't remember what sales uses, but like it's in 4 different places. So every time there's a major cross-functional collaboration, it's like which tool are we using is the starting question. And that's really hard on people in terms of doing it. Third is obviously documentation. And if you read through GitLab's content in particular, you'll find the richness that actually all of us would love to get to, but of documentation of not only decisions and what we're doing, but of how we work. All of those decisions, at least within your own team, will get you started on a much better path than I think where most people start out today. The other thing within a lot of organizations is what's your default? What I mean by default is, are you using public channels? Like I came from Slack. There's a core decision that was made at Slack years ago that's very different from Teams. Teams defaults to private channels. Slack defaults to public for a reason, which is we believed that more of your work should be done in public, because the more that's done in public, the more available it is for other people to find it, to read it, to understand what's going on. There's a very famous story behind this, which has to do with Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter. He brought in a set of leaders from SpaceX who were doing personnel assessments. SpaceX uses Teams, Twitter uses Slack. They were using Slack to discuss who they were going to terminate in a public channel. So make sure you know what this system is that you're using and how it works. But defaulting to public is generally better for most things. Documentation matters a lot. It's hard to do and easy to say. But the more that you can document what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how it's coming along, the better. The last thing I'm going to touch on goes back a bit to what Sasha was talking about in terms of you're all in a distributed world. How do you ensure that both from a synchronous and asynchronous perspective, you're retaining your visibility inside of the organization and creating connections? This is a slightly different visual than a slide that Sasha had in her presentation. find a way, for those of you that raise your hands and say that your team doesn't have the budget to get together, find a way to do it. All of the companies that were remote first prior to the pandemic found a way to get their teams together on at least a once-a-year basis. And it was the trade-off of office space versus travel funds. The graph is Atlassian's data about the decay rate of what happens when you get people together. There's a big boost that happens from team gatherings that persists for 4 to 5 months. It is almost critical for new hires and new people on teams to do this. By the way, they measured this against chance office encounters, and those team gatherings actually won out. I've written case studies on Zillow and Allstate. Zillow has a different but very similar approach. They have a centralized group called Cruise Control that manages their Z retreats, which is their team get-togethers. They ran over 500 of these in 2023 that brought together, on average, about 25 people. In 2024, they actually are taking the number down and the size up. They'll do about 200 different events with about 75 people in it, because the idea is we want more of those weak ties, more of those cross connects to come together. They've also instrumented this, and they know what's working and not. Mixing together business plus social time makes a big difference. Allstate, 50,000 person organization, has people where they can't afford to fly them into places, but what they did is they give the entire organization, they handed out $10 million at the director level and below for people to figure out what are ways in which we can build connections. So some of that was getting together, some of that was meals. One of my favorites was a Lego building exercise. Facilitated by somebody who knew how to do what they were doing and found a way for people who were dialed in from different places to do a physical object exercise together and share it with one another. So find a way to do it. Second, asynchronously, you can share your personal user manual, your About Me page. Mine's much uglier than Sasha's. Hers is a lovely graphic. This is literally mine from 2 years ago. I am an ENFP, hello ISFJs. And that's like an aspect of it, but the really important stuff is understanding, am I a morning person or a night person? How do I operate in terms of when I'm at my best? How do I operate when I'm at my worst? What are the things that I love to do? What are the things that make me crazy? And especially when you're working with your manager, how do you help me grow? I recommend almost all the time to managers that they do this first. Because a manager who's willing to go first to share with their team their personal user manual is setting the tone for vulnerability and for openness and for what is okay from their team's perspective. If you can do that, what you're doing is you're not only building connections with people and better understanding, you're building psychological safety, right? You're saying it's okay to talk about these things at work. It's okay to talk about the fact that I've got 2 kids and one of them, requires that I actually am out of the office by 4 o'clock or out offline by 4 o'clock 3 days a week. So understanding that avoids a lot of misconceptions with people, as well as helps you get deeper on building a sense of belonging within a team. The other side of this is you can create virtual connections. I would use this a lot with executives. In 2017, when I joined Slack, I hosted a group of CIOs in New York. And how many of you know what the random channel is in Slack? Okay. The random channel is literally the random channel. It's a default channel that a lot of people fill up with entertaining, interesting jokes and memes and GIFs and everything else. And of the CIOs that we pulled together in New York when I was first joining, I'd say 2/3 of them said, could you please kill the random channel? It's silly and it's not about work. Fast forward to 2021, McKinsey's CIO comes up to me and goes, I was wrong. The social channels in Slack, if we didn't have those, we'd be kind of dead in the water from a sense of belonging and understanding each other and knowing what we're about and how we're doing it. The digital tools that you use at work aren't just about productivity, they're actually about connection and how you build connections with groups. I talked earlier about like icebreakers and exercises you can do inside of a virtual meeting. I shared the Atlassian example of open team time just to have conversations. But those social connections can also happen in different ways. A guy told me a story who was in a different consulting firm that he worked in New York and he and friends were all sneakerheads, Nike collectors. And there are about 5 of them in the New York office. And once or twice a week, they would go around showing them the new kicks and what they got, and they'd talk about new sales going up. When everything went virtual in the pandemic, he started up a channel called sneakerheads with those 5 people. Now, you know what? 5 other people, would occasionally comment on this. Let's add them. And those people said, well, about these other people. 5 became 15, became 1,500 people within a month globally. There were sneakerheads. Nike called them up because Nike heard about this and said, this is really cool. One of the executives said, wait a minute, this thing's really cool. Could you do this with a whole bunch of other teams? He's like, wait, hold on, that's not my job. But what he was doing wasn't just creating connections across people. All of a sudden, you're meeting people you might not meet otherwise. You might not know, you're on the sales team in New York, you might not know who on the marketing team has the answers you're looking for, but you know Sue on the marketing team who's in California because you've been going back and forth with her every week in the Sneakerheads channel. So you got somebody you can go to and ask a question because you've developed a relationship. That's not even getting into the fact that ERGs are really an essential, like the channels for ERGs are a really essential group that we've seen do this time and again. And there's a lot of debate around DEI that I personally find problematic in the public sphere, but ERG channels I've seen be really effective, not just around like allyship. The more important part is giving people who are geographically distributed in very small pockets, whether it is from a abilities perspective, whether it is from a race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, who often are very distributed in an organization, a place to talk to one another in their own private space, to find support with each other. And I will defend that use case until I fall over, because I think it's really important in terms of building a sense of belonging and finding people that will help you in your own organization. The last thing I'm going to say for all of you is, Sasha talked about this, proximity bias is a real thing. Some leaders are literally verbal about this, right? Dell told people earlier this year, if you are not in the office 3 days a week, you will not get promoted. By the way, the consequence of that was about half their organization said, so what? The trade-off's not worth it. I'm not doing it. But you need to understand that out of sight can be out of mind, and you need to make yourself visible. Sasha talked about this a little bit too, but proactive communications, not waiting for your boss to ask you a question, but making sure you're providing updates and what you're doing, not just to your boss, but to your team and to your coworkers in terms of what's going on. If on my very first question about goal setting, you don't have clarity, ask for clarity. Ask to create clarity in terms of what goals do I have and how do I provide updates on them. I'm getting the high sign. This is my last slide. I swear to God, I'm almost done. The last thing I'll say on this is sharing insights and ideas and promoting changes. Whether you take one slide out of this, one idea out of this, whether you grab stuff from Atlassian or Dropbox or GitLab, grab something that you want to see your team do and promote that within your own team. And that's where change actually starts. Every time I work with executives, the starting point isn't take this stuff. It's find the team within your organization that's already doing this today, because there's always a team that's doing stuff that's different from everybody else, that gets how to work better and more effectively, and has gotten a much better handle on how they work as an organization.